What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about the other index that we have for Warhammer 40k 10th edition, the Space Marines. We talked about Tyranids in the last video, talking about the winners and losers from their index, the units that were most improved, or maybe saw some unneeded debuffs, and today we're doing the same thing for Space Marines, and I'm going to throw in a little bit of a curveball, because I'm also going to talk about some honorable mentions, units that were already good and will continue to be pretty good in 10th edition. I've been spending all weekend playing games of Warhammer 40k 10th edition with the Tyranid Codex against the Space Marine Index, and I'm going to be putting those up on my replay channel so you can see some of the units that we're going to be talking about here today in action. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, please drop a like on the video, subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff. You know what's up. You're a smart person. I believe in you. And let's dive in. Now, we're starting at the bottom with the losers. Now, we don't have points quite yet, so it could be that some stuff is hyper expensive and maybe overpriced. And I hope these units are not among those because their profiles are not that exciting. The first one is the Repulsor Executioner. This is one of my favorite tanks in the game. I love how it looks, but unfortunately, it's just not cutting the mustard, in my opinion, in this new edition. Mostly, this isn't because of the weakness of the Repulsor itself, just its comparison with some of its contemporaries. Things like the Gladiator Lancer mount almost the exact same weapon with a bunch of buffs for it, and without having all of the additional baggage of having to transport models, equipping a lot of anti-infantry weapons, and having some not super useful strength 4 AP0 defensive array attacks. The Repulsor Executioner, all in all, isn't that bad of a profile. It's just a big tank with a big laser gun on the top, but you can source profiles very similar to this laser gun on other chassis, without the additional inefficiency of being on a big, bulky repulsor body. Suppressor squads also enter this one. These guys just aren't really doing it. They do something unique, which is suppressing their target. If they score a hit with their accelerator autocannons, then the target will suffer -1 to its attack rolls for a turn, and that's pretty good. Unfortunately, suffering a hit with those autocannons is a little bit tough because they are a base ballistic skill 4 and relying on the heavy keyword to actually hit. Even when they hit, they're just a strictly worse profile than a standard autocannon. They do fire 3 times rather than the normal 2, but only strength 8 means they wound a lot of vehicles on 5s and will have trouble punching through armor at only AP1. And even when they do, only 2 damage isn't really doing too much. I think really these guys want to be shooting at infantry out in the open, which, to be fair, most weapons are good at killing. So outside of the utility that suppressor squads add, they're not really that exciting. That said, a 3-model Deep Strike squad is pretty good, and if they are the correct point cost, they could see some play just as a utility unit to drop in your opponent's backline and score some objectives. Speaking of objectives, the next unit on the losers list here today is a classic one, Reavers. If any faction isn't wanting for an absolute glut of strength 4 AP0 1 damage, potentially precision attacks, it's probably Space Marines. Basically every model in the faction has a bolt rifle and has the same melee profile, which means Reavers aren't doing anything particularly special. They do have some support effects. They can be upgraded to Deep Strike, which, as we talked about with suppressors, is pretty nice, and they do force battle shock checks, but at only OC1, they're really relying on battle shock to allow them to steal objectives from enemy units, and despite the fact that they impose a penalty on leadership checks, relying on battle shock checks in order to actually do your objective control is not really a great place to be. It means that you don't really have any agency over whether or not these Reavers are doing their job. Honestly, it's just really kind of a sad place for the Reavers to be. They fulfill a role that hasn't really ever been that great in the infrastructure of Warhammer 40k, and I think that they're going to continue to not be that amazing. There are some interesting attachments for them. You can attach things like the Phobos Lieutenant, who can make them a little bit faster, or even the Phobos Librarian, who makes them untargetable from shooting, which is pretty sweet in conjunction with their 6-inch scout move before the game begins. But as we'll talk about later, there are going to be some units that make more use of these forward operating and scout style mechanics without relying on getting a slow, relatively light hitting unit into melee in order to get value out of themselves. Now, last and potentially least on this list is going to be a unit that has fallen from the vaunted halls of hallowed Space Marine heroes, and one of the primary melee hitters for the last 2 editions of the Codex, the Vanguard Veterans. These guys have been split into 2 separate datasheets, the Jump Pack Vanguard Veteran Squad and a Foot Vanguard Veteran Squad. Both of them gain the Vanguard Assault ability, which gives them lethal hits on the charge with their heirloom weapons, a 4 attack strength 5 AP1 kind of not particularly exciting weapon profile. Unfortunately, they've lost all of their options. One of the big benefits of Vanguard veteran squads in the past was the ability to equip a wide variety of special weapons and melee war gear, and that's no longer the case. Now they just have their heirloom weapons in melee, and while they can take storm shields and an interesting selection of pistols, those are the only options available to them. The foot Vanguard veteran unit does have a 6-inch scout move to make up for the fact that they are a little bit slower, and I think potentially in some situations with characters like Gabriel Seth who buff them specifically, there can be uses for Vanguard veterans, but they are no longer the melee powerhouses that we've seen them be in the past, especially when you compare them to even just the regular foot Assault Marine squad, which can also gain lethal hits on its chainsword. They do lose 1 point of strength, but get a lot more optionality, and I imagine will be a lot cheaper. It's a sad time for the Vanguard veterans, but they just don't really compare with the lack of the wide variety of options that they used to have in the past. And with that, that's all the losers we have for the index. Let's move on to some happier information and talk about some honorable mentions, units that were already good in 9th edition and are going to continue to be staples in 10th edition. The first one I have in here is a unit that got a massive redesign in 10th edition. This is the Incursor Squad. These guys have gotten kind of the Phobos rework. Phobos units have moved from being entirely infiltrators and building up an entire army of units that deploy outside your deployment zone to being split basically half and half between infiltrating and scout moving. Incursors now have a scout move versus the standard infiltrators infiltrator deployment, which means that they're more flexible, but less powerful, since they're not going to be able to deploy as far forward as the infiltrators will. That said, you actually want Incursors to be moving with the bulk of your team. Because of their new multi-spectrum array ability, every time they shoot, you can choose an enemy hit by one or more of their attacks made by their Oculus Bolt Carbines, an assault ignore cover weapon, and it gives the entirety of your army +1 to hit that unit with ranged attacks. Not only are they an incredible utility unit because they have assault weapons, allowing them to advance and perform the new edition's equivalent of actions, they can also buff everyone else with shooting. The next up is the Redemptor Dreadnought. These guys were already good as being an all-rounder, good in melee, good at shooting, relatively defensive in 9th edition, and they're basically the same in 10th. They have a ton of ranged attacks, a lot of really sweet weapon profiles, whether or not you're taking double onslaught Gatling cannons and trying to spam devastating wounds, or you're just firing plasma cannons at someone. Both of those are great, and while they have been debuffed in melee, they are still pretty solid. But really, the big headliner are their incredible defensive stat line. A 2+ save is kind of the staple for vehicles in 10th edition. Because you can benefit from cover in vehicles extremely easily, a 2+ save effectively goes down to the equivalent of a 1+ save, ignoring the first point of AP that your opponent is going to be delivering to you. And because Redemptor Dreadnoughts retain their Duty Eternal ability, unlike every other style of Dreadnought in the Codex, they remain -1 damage. And with their newfound toughness of 10, even medium anti-tank weaponry bounces off that defensive stat line. These things are incredibly hard to kill, especially once you start dumping defensive stratagems like Armor of Contempt on them. While we don't know their value yet, I'm sure it will take significantly more of the opponent's army to kill them than they're worth. Now let's move up to winners, and I'm going to talk about both some individual units and combinations of units that got significantly better in this new index. The first one is the lowly Hellblaster Squad. These guys were always kind of a weird unit. They had a multitude of offensive profiles, but none of them were particularly good, but now they've just moved to having basically a 2-shot plasma gun. Now the plasma gun profile isn't quite as good as it was in 9th because strength 8 isn't really what it was used to be, but with O's of Moment and the easy access to wound rerolls, these things can still pack a pretty decent punch. You're not even afraid of overcharging your weapons and losing your expensive Hellblasters, however, because of their new ability to fire anytime they're destroyed, even if they kill themselves. Not only does this give them resilience against their hazardous ability, since if they die, that model who dies will still get to fire a second time with an overcharged plasma gun, but your opponent is also not really that excited about shooting back at them, since there's a very good chance that the Hellblasters will return fire and finish off whatever enemy unit they were shooting at. In addition to the new firing deck rules out of transports like Impulsors, Hellblasters are going to be an absolute staple as a mid-range, highly flexible DPS unit. All of these Storm Speeder varieties have gotten a huge glow up in this edition, now adding some very useful support effects to the army, in addition to their speed, relative resilience, and high damage output. And the best one, in my opinion, is the Storm Speeder Thunderstrike. In addition to the multitude of d6+1 damage missiles and las talons the Thunderstrike carries, it also has its new Thunderstrike ability, giving you +1 to wound against an enemy monster or vehicle that the Thunderstrike shoots at. This means it can start an engagement with its powerful Strength 12 Storm Fury missiles and give that buff to the rest of your army, meaning those Hellblaster squads we just talked about are now wounding basically every target that they have in their sights on 4s. Alongside Oaths of Movement rerolls and other buff effects like Incursors, this makes the Space Marine army ridiculously efficient when it comes to their attacks. But not only that, they also have access to some incredible utility units, and one of the most important ones are the Sniper Scout team. Scouts are now bifurcated into 2 separate datasheets: the standard classic melee and close combat scouts, able to equip assault and melee weapons, and the Sniper Scouts, who have their camo cloaks giving them the stealth ability. These guys are incredibly powerful, and I think that they herald an archetype of unit that is going to be insanely transformative to the 10th edition metagame. These guys, thanks to their concealed positions ability, essentially have the lone operatives effect on their entire unit. This is the new form of character protection that restricts targeting of ranged attacks from outside 12 inches, with no other restrictions. Even if you're the closest unit and widely open, out of cover, visible to your opponent, they cannot shoot you unless they're within 12. And if you combine them with units like infiltrators that restrict enemy deep striking, you can make it almost impossible for your opponent to actually interact with these guys. That makes them incredibly safe at holding backline objectives and screening out your opponent, where you can set them up in positions to interact with objectives or prevent deep strikes for the entire game, and there's nothing your opponent can do about it unless they can get up very close or get them stuck into melee. But not only that, but Sniper Scouts also have an incredible damage output. With an AP2 2 damage precision weapon, they're pretty lethal, and you can even attach characters like Talion to give them a little bit more of a smooth damage output against a wider variety of enemy profiles. Given the lethality of 10th edition, specifically against infantry squads, well, I think vehicles are much more difficult to kill than they were previously. Lighter infantry is actually incredibly easy to remove, especially with the new blast rules and indirect fire, making profiles like the Sniper Scouts usually very susceptible to enemy ranged attacks. It's my opinion that units that have these untargetability effects will reign supreme. I'm a little bit worried that we may be headed for a metagame where units that don't have abilities like these are all but unplayable, and units with these kinds of abilities will basically run the roost. Now, moving on, we do have a unit that could potentially deal with these untargetable enemies. This is the Inceptor Squad. These guys got a huge transformation to their ranged attacks. They're no longer random shot blast weapons, they are instead twin-linked pistol weapons. This gives them full rerolls to wound, meaning that they aren't necessarily beholden to Oaths of Moment in order to punch damage through on enemy targets. And even against heavy infantry, they're going to be pretty lethal thanks to the 3 damage on their overcharged plasma weapons. On top of that, they have the ability to deep strike 3 inches away from enemies rather than the normal 9, so they can actually jump onto objectives that your opponent thought they were holding, or get lines of sight that your opponent wasn't necessarily aware of. Alongside some of the other support effects that we've talked about before, if you're able to get shots with Incursors or the Thunderstrike, you can buff these guys up, and without even the need for Oaths of Moment, thanks to their twin linked rerolls, they're going to be able to do massive damage from absolutely unexpected directions. Even if your opponent has untargetable infantry, the Inceptors can drop down regardless of how hard they're screened out and just blast them off the table. Another unit that's going to be able to get up close and personal and excel at this kind of maneuver warfare are the standard bike squad, but specifically when attached with a bike chaplain. The old Primaris chaplain datasheet has turned into the new generic bike chaplain datasheet, and like all chaplains, he brings an improved leadership characteristic and +1 to wound in melee, which is pretty useful, but most importantly, you're bringing him for his Catechism of Fire, which grants devastating wounds to models in his unit against a visible enemy within 12 inches. Given that these bikes are able to move 12 and advance in fire under the Devastator Doctrine, you're not really going to have a trouble getting within 12. Now, you might ask what weapons benefit most from this, and the answer is pretty simple. Not only are these guys going to have twin-linked bolters on all of their bikes, but you're able to equip a grav pistol and 2 grav guns. These anti-vehicle 2+ weapons will convert their attacks into critical hits on the wound roll of a 2+. Almost all of their hit rolls are going to convert directly into mortal wounds that bypass all of your opponent's saves. Because they have those twin-linked weapons with the ability to reroll their wound rolls, they also have a good opportunity to score additional 6s to wound, which will then also similarly convert into mortal wounds. On average, this unit is probably probably good for 8 to 9 mortal wounds fired onto a vehicle, but if you can source them a bonus to hit or rerolls in any way, that's going to get significantly more dangerous. And unfortunately, while they don't hit monsters or other heavy infantry, they're still fine at shooting at those units, and they're fast enough that they can interact with objectives, charge into enemy utility units or lone operators, and mostly give your opponent a hard time. For a tiny unit of bikers in one character, they're likely to be relatively inexpensive and good at secondary objectives, so I don't really see a downside. But tanks are going to be so popular in this edition that having a unit that can point and click almost entirely destroy a tank by themselves is incredibly useful. Now, speaking of point and click adventure games, the last one we have is one that I think is going to be meta warping from the Space Marine Codex moving on into the future: the Vindicator and its attached land speeder. Land speeders now, just similar to the storm speeders, all bring interesting support effects to the army. And the standard land speeder, the little heavy bolter equipped utility unit that we all know and love from the heady days of Oaths of Moment, scoring for sitting them in the middle of the table, these guys are now able to give +1 to hit and ignore cover to blast weapons targeting a single enemy that the land speeder has visibility to. If you combo this with some of the incredibly powerful blast weapons on vehicles like the Vindicator, this gets absolutely insane. It's toughness 11 and a 2+ save, and like I've talked about before, a 2+ save is so valuable in 10th edition that I think you're going to value that higher than any other statistic on these vehicles. That said, its weapon profiles are absolutely ludicrous, with its Demolisher Cannon firing D6 + 3, Strength 14, AP 3, D6 shots, getting the benefits of that synergy with the land speeder, then hitting on 2s and ignoring cover. Because cover is going to be so prevalent in this edition, that effectively makes it the equivalent of AP 4. And if you get rerolls from Oaths of Moment or another effect, the Vindicator is going to be wounding basically any vehicle in the game on 3s or potentially 4s and rerolling all of those wound rolls. There are very few vehicles in the game that can survive a single shot from a Vindicator, especially if you add some CP rerolls or additional AP from Storm of Fire. And this vehicle by itself is going to be one-shotting a vast majority of the game. On top of that, it's also highly resilient to return fire shooting, especially given the Space Marine's ability to combo stratagems like Armor of Contempt with Smokescreen. If you have support characters like Robute Gilliman next to it, you can use one of those for free, spend 1 CP on the other one, and put this guy to the equivalent of a 0-up save with -1 to be hit while standing in the wide open with no terrain around him whatsoever. I don't think there's going to be weapons that can kill that profile on the swing back, and so the Vindicator is going to live to fire its cannon another day. Even engaging these guys doesn't help that much. Not only can they fall back and shoot normally with the tactical doctrine, but they can also just fire their cannon into engagement range despite the fact that it has the blast keyword thanks to their dozer shield. And with the new Overwatch rules, just checking whether or not you're eligible to shoot, that means that you could charge the Vindicator and it could drop a shell on its own feet and blow you up before you even get to swing. I'm honestly a little bit worried about the power level of this vehicle. Comparing it to some of the other profiles that we've seen in the game so far, it looks pretty pushed, but we'll have to see what points values look like for the Space Marine Index before we make any final judgments. And with that, that's all I have to say about this Space Marine Index. Let me know down in the comment section if you agree with my picks for the best winners and losers, and if you have any data sheets that you thought I missed and should maybe take another look at. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.